This is Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Here are your hosts, Dr. Tim Slecker and Dr. Johnny Lupinacci, educated educators talking education.
Welcome to Busted Pencils, the extended pod. Hey, last week on the radio show, we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, and then we started exploring Indigenous ways of knowing with a great guest. Today, we go deeper. He has been an educator for 4 decades, previously director of the education at the Oglala Lakota College. He is currently a professor in Fielding Graduate University's Educational Leadership for Change doctoral program, selected by AERO as one of 27 visionaries in education. He's the author of 24 books, including Restoring the Kinship Worldview, selected by UC Berkeley's Science Center for the Greater Good as one of the top thought-provoking, inspiring, and practice science books of 2022. A musician, surfer, horseman, and environmental activist. He lives in Jalisco, Mexico, where he uses Indigenous worldview as part of his work in creating a marine sanctuary on the Pacific coast of, is it Jalisco?
Jalisco, Mexico.
Jalisco.
Welcome back to Busted Pencils, Wahinkpe Topa, 4 Arrows. 4 Arrows, thank you for coming back.
Well, thank you for having me on again. You guys really busted some pencils in our live radio interview. I really appreciate it, and I loved your conclusions when I got off.
Well, then you said today is the day to really go deeper, and I want to set this up though too, with 2 questions. So 4 Arrows, and this is going to be a big one. Do as best you can with kind of bringing this in. Indigenous ways of knowing. How would you define that to my neighbor who's listening to the show saying, what are they talking about? Indigenous ways of knowing.
Well, I would like to start with a representation of it. And that is, I'm going to, with your permission, say a really short Lakota prayer. And the reason I'm saying the prayer is because this perspective of indigeneity, or what you're asking me to describe, what is the way of how our ancestors lived for 99% of human history, was a spiritual orientation. And if we want to contrast that in a non-dualistic way, we can contrast that with a materialistic one. And so all the indigenous peoples who still remember the old ways and is able to perform them, spirit is in everything. And so a meeting like this, a collaborative dialogue amongst colleagues, really, if we don't bring spirit into it, then we are missing a large part of what the indigenous ways of knowing are all about. And so this Lakota prayer is a typical kind of a prayer that when I was at Oglala Lakota College, we started every class, every meeting with. And it talks about a great mysterious thing, because this idea of God and indigeneity is like, whoa, it's too mysterious to be able to identify. So the word wakantanka, which is representative of this great mysterious thing, it's a verb like most indigenous words are. And right away it goes into a term of endearment of grandfather, because the expression of the great mysterious is in the frogs, it's in the trees, it's in the animals, and it's in us when we're operating at our highest balanced self. And so this just says, help us with help. It's asking the spirits to come in and help us with the dialogue for the greater good, for the rebalancing of the earth. So please join me.
Sure.
Otogashila wakantaka namakompo natatela topa unshimaka ahituayam kelo oyate oyasin chanko luta okhnamani oichakiapo oyate oyasin unchi wichalapo no oichakiapo echo witozani washte uniwa pigtelo ihani la ko wichohaki tunkashe la kiksuye So by starting that way, we should, even without knowing the words, don't you feel like, whoa, now there's more of us, there's more of who we really are, because we are spirits inhabiting a body. You don't talk about that in education very much, do we?
No.
We talk about important things like critical pedagogy and communication and collaboration, things that Michael Fullen is advocating for and have been a part of my training and education. And yet, just like with Paulo Freire, getting this idea of spirit being in everything is a true missing link in education. In fact, when I went back to get my second doctorate at Boise State, the first article I had published was in Taboo, Shirley, and so the name of it was Critical Pedagogy and Spirituality: The Missing Partnership. That was the first article that I had published while in that doctoral program. And so the question is, what does it mean? Well, it's how we lived according to nature, and an understanding that nature is sentient and spiritual, and that we are part of nature. If you look at most dictionaries, including Oxford University, and put in the word nature, Nature, and the majority of them say essentially everything but human beings.
Yeah, it's something apart.
Yeah, and so that would be I think the biggest key is the sense of authentic interconnectedness. And from that, it ranges out into the 40 worldview precepts that are contrasting between what we could call the dominant manifestations in economics, education, media, entertainment, sports, and those of the 40 of the indigenous. And the idea isn't to look at, these are bad and these are good, because that is a dominant worldview perspective. That's a Rush Limbaugh. You're either with us or against us, or a George Bush, you're with us or against us. So it's a matter of saying, okay, we're all in the same boat. We all are part of nature. We all are one at some level. And so the opposites, like hot and cold and day and night and black and white and left-handed and right-handed, all really have a union that has to be sought if we're going to live in balance, right? And so these are the key things. And by studying these precepts, like anthropocentrism versus seeing sentience, for example, or spirituality versus materialism as priorities, we begin to get back into the kind of understandings and ways of being in the world that would prevent us from polluting waters and doing the kind of wars like are happening in the horrors of what we're seeing in Palestine and Israel now.
Mm-hmm. What you're saying, though, it sounds inviting. It sounds like you're asking, and it's a Johnny and Tim to be a part of something that you're doing for AEROs. And I want to put this in the form, though, of a question and maybe put it out there this way. So how does a 5th grade science teacher incorporate teaching Indigenous ways of knowing without misappropriating the culture? Because you feel like you're asking us to come with you on this journey and teach. And we get a sense, in fact, we were talking about it towards the end of the radio show, that there's a genuine, and I mean this, like an honest fear in some great teachers of engaging in, not wanting to engage in misappropriation. And then potentially, though, I hear you saying you're asking us to come and be a part of this. So how do I be a part of without misappropriating?
A beautiful question. And I'm so happy that you are saying that I'm inviting, because that's exactly a beautiful way to say it. And the question you raise is a good way to start, Tim, because it is a big barrier for making this happen that I had bumped into for 40 years. I'll tell you a little story to just to give you an example. I was on Mark Sorensen, is a non-Indian, amazing guy who started the Star School for Navajos in Arizona. And service to all relations is what the STAR stands for. And he's got a beautiful solar-powered place right next to the reservation, and it's really doing great. But he's always struggling, of course, with the state mandates. Mm. Well, we did a fundraiser. I was a founding board member, and we did a fundraiser. My wife and I play old-time jazz piano, and she plays the old banjo. And we had another professor that actually played the clarinet. We were playing these 20s and 30s kind of jazz songs. And that was what was going to be bringing in the people, the non-Indians from Flagstaff to donate this to the school. And then there was lots of conversations about what the school's doing and stuff. So when I was playing the last song, instead of playing, a blues song like Louis Armstrong or something, I sang and played a ceremonial spiritual song from the Iñipi ceremony. And as I sang the song and played it. It was a thank you song. Mm-hmm. As I put my keyboard away, a respected medicine person came up and scolded me. Mm. You know better than to take that out of the circle and share that with non-Indian people. Mm-hmm. And I patted him on the shoulder and thanked him. And I said, we agree to disagree on this, brother. Mm. Not a minute later, another highly respected, I always like to say when I tell a story, a little more respected medicine person came up and hugged me and said, thank you for taking this out of the circle. So Indian country is divided. So there's three categories of teachers that I could maybe name, and one is that come on, anything in the native past is baloney. We were cannibals. We destroyed properties. We destroyed animals. It's a good thing. And in my book Unlearning the Language of Conquest that the University of Texas published, where Vine Deloria Jr. was his last thing he wrote. And a chapter, and his chapter was called Conquest Masquerading as Law. But in it, we really exposed professors from UCLA, Oxford, whose books became bestsellers, and they were completely poor research and just talking about the warlike, all the bad things that we've learned in our history books, essentially. So the first category is those folks who are so much into the hegemony and the anti-Indianism that there's this discrimination and this rejection of anything that could be possibly good. But now, and we've got more and more of changes happening, we've got a lot of good liberal professors and teachers in elementary school and in high school, middle school, who are saying, there's something. I know that there's something. I mean, it's not just romance. And I'm not talking about romanticizing it. Romanticizing indigeneity is worse than saying the opposite of how horrible it is. But they say, but you know what? There's so much misappropriation and so much problems. I'm going to support indigenous people, as a category of people like Black people or Hispanics. But this idea of me trying to teach spirituality, oh my gosh, or teach anything about their worldview, that would just be, I'd be guilty of misappropriation.
Yes.
I
don't agree. But I think that view that you just put out there, number 2, is the one we're really kind of getting at. But keep going where you were going.
Well, and then the third one is the one Fool's Crow is probably one of the most respected. Fool's Crow is, one of the most respected of the historical 1800s Lakota elders that people really, really treasure. And I've quoted him in almost all my books because this issue is so important. And essentially, he says, first of all, we need allies, even in the 1800s, right? And non-indigenous allies. as the Cherokee had, before the Trail of Tears. They took it to the Supreme Court, the non-Indian lawyers, that it was wrong for Andrew Jackson to kick them out of their homelands. And these allies, if they're good-hearted and they want to learn these ways, that he refers to it as the medicine, that these ways are the medicine. And he said, a quote is, any of my brothers and sisters, I think he said any of my brothers, because the sisters get it, the women get this. He said, anyone who does not understand or who does not want to share this medicine doesn't understand it. And, that's a position that I think is so important. Christine Habler is a very well-known producer. Her and Clint Eastwood did the great movie Indian Horse, based on the book. And she contacted me. I didn't know who she was. She knew about my work. And I can say this publicly because I wrote about it in the article that I mentioned in our radio show, The Indigenization Controversy, For Whom by Whom, out of critical education at University of British Columbia. And so she's in Canada, and I mean, she's having, Indigenous people play the roles. They're doing prayers before every scene. I mean, she's really going to the full. Well, the author dies in the middle of the making of the film, and she continues going forward, with all her heart and soul. A group of Indigenous women, and this really made it even harder for her, wrote her and said, you have no right to continue this film without the guidance of someone who can take his place. And it was a harsh, very harsh film. I mean, a harsh criticism that she didn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. So we talked about it, and the reason I wrote that article, and her story is part of the article, was to get this out into Canada, that we've got to have a different approach to it, right? So yes, it is there. But here's the thing that I think will answer your question, and for the people that are listening.
Fifth grade science teacher wants to do it, but is frightened, right?
If the fifth grade science teacher says to himself, "Look, I've listened to the show of Busted Pencils, and this is what I learned. I'm right in not wanting to misappropriate traditional ecological knowledge, which is well respected in science, but never utilized, sort of like the school programs we've been talking about, And that place-based knowledge that they have is so vital. I want to do everything I can to support their sovereignty and their efforts to be able to maintain their land and their language. But I'm not going to teach any of it, because no way. If you don't know the language fluently, if you don't know the ceremonies, and if you haven't lived in one place multi-generationally to know from observation how things work, and the weather and the animals and the foods and everything, that's to do those ceremonies and stuff like that. Whoa, come on, but guess what? Each of those unique place-based knowledges in cultures that are very different around the world have common themes that we talk about when we talk about the science of worldview. Okay. And I've lived with dozens of cultures and visited many, and in my doctoral studied 150. It's amazing. I was just back from being with the Kogi of Colombia, and very different. It's like, I wanted them. We built an Anipi lodge, a ceremony lodge, and I wanted them to come and join me. Well, we're putting rocks in a fire. They had never seen that before, and rocks are sacred to them, right? And they won't let a child move a rock off of a path, right? And here I'm asking them to come in. I'm going to take these rocks, and so they had to go all the way back up their mountain and get the whole community together to talk about. We like this guy, and he's an elder, but so yet at the same time, once we talked about it and we found out that, oh my gosh, this is one of the most sacred rocks in the world that goes into an Anipi. They're Inya. They are used to be people that gave everything away, and all that's left was their generosity, and etc. So the common themes are worldview. Well, if a worldview is about, and I hate that word, we've tried to use existence, scape, and all different kinds of words, because the indigenous way isn't about visual, it's about beingness. However, it is a science that in the academy has got so much clout now and meaningfulness that we use it, and so the worldview belongs to everyone who wants to know what the truth about how the world is, right? I mean, if you've got the worldview that is accurate, or you got a worldview that isn't, and a worldview that puts human beings at the top, a worldview that allows profit from a corporation to be more important than the cleanliness of water that we drink. It just isn't the right way to understand the world. Teachers can get behind that, because not only because it does belong to all of us, but if they do their very best to understand the common denominators and the theories, and look at the worldview precepts, which are pretty basic, moral precepts, then they've got to say, wow, this is something that undergirds religions, cultures, ideologies, philosophies, and science. And so why shouldn't we bring it in to the classroom?
You think about, I mean, I know I had Johnny to jump in here, but it made me think for arrows too, that you're, hearing this, there's the common sense that comes across that says, well, this is why it's not misappropriation. It's just damn important to be teaching this worldview, because, our existence depends on it. And so as a teacher, I don't need to be worried about misappropriation, because I'm coming at this and saying my job as a teacher is creating that ability for humanity to understand something that allows us to be better. Johnny, I don't know, is that too simple?
I mean, in essence, Tim, I agree with you, and I tend to fall off the I move away from the better, because it gets into this kind of conflict of like having to prove ourselves. And and what I'm picking up on, and as 4 hours is sharing with us here today, thank you 4 hours for sharing and for bringing in all of those guests with us today who are present for this conversation, and for all the listeners that are part of that as well. It's truly a gift to be in this dialogue. But I'm returning to Tim, that in this work, in challenging that worldview, if we're to use that term of like human supremacists or anthropocentric, which is human-centered, as it leads to human supremacy, right? In most modern or Eurocentric cultures that, Tim, you and I are embedded deeply into, and that our schools, by and large, are designed by, and every aspect of it sort of is based on this assumption of the individual, and of success being defined by the illusion of somebody being independent from everything else. And so this is highly problematic. But in communicating that, what I'm reminded of in this conversation is, we talked about at the end of the show, the importance of humility, the importance of saying to our colleagues or to fellow teachers in that conversation, hey, it's not about better. It's about what we do to find balance together. Let's move out of the who's right, who's wrong, and into this, we're in it, and our children's children and their children are connected to the decisions that we're making today together. And with all the information and opportunity we have to listen to and to take a position of humility, not humiliation. These words get kind of murky, right? With I might not know what's best or know everything, but together with all the possible perspectives, we might make better decisions. And this is where I think diverse indigenous knowledges around the world have been and continue to be incredibly not only valuable. I don't want to commodify them, right? Because as soon as we put value on it, we start to talk about like, okay, now it's time to use, after we've exploited relationships for so long, and dishonored and disrespected it. Now it's got a use, and we're going to recognize it and value it. This is an important pitfall to avoid. I think it's really essential to situate that if we need to shift how we're doing things as a human species, as diverse cultures around the world, that we acknowledge that the crisis that the world is in is not inherently or naturally human. And this is where I part with some of the scientists that go there. Because we have mature cultures and indigenous peoples around the world who for thousands of years have known that it's important for us to live differently. And so this is where I think it's important to assume a position of humility and think about in those categories where Four Arrows was kind of talking about the teachers coming to this. There's this space between I think wiser teachers. They might not be veteran teachers. There may be some of the new teachers who are coming into this moment, right? This is the largest social uprising of all of our lifetimes. So young people are coming and saying, we're going to do this differently. This is exciting. But they're cautious of two things. They and Four Arrows mentioned this. They don't want to over romanticize, right? And then the other is, how do they navigate coming to this invitation? How do they accept the invitation with honor and humility? And so Four Arrows, that's the question I have. Can you explain two things for us? One, for our listeners, and clarity. What does it mean to romanticize indigenous knowledge? Because you said that's almost worse than doing the whole Native people lived in accordance with the land because they were primitive or savage. And I don't believe these things, but that's most of what history books have taught dominant culture, right? So we say we don't want to be in that group, and then somebody says, well, you're teaching indigenous knowledges, you just are romanticizing indigenous people, right? So they get grouped there. Can you explain what is that problem that exists in terms of folks in romanticizing indigenous knowledges and peoples?
Well, I don't want to put down the New Age movement, because the New Age movement has a lot of good things. But the New Age movement would be an example of a tendency to romanticize and to play Indian, because they recognize rightfully that we're on a wrong path. And there's enough information out there about the sustainability and the happiness and the respect for women, that are rightfully assigned to traditional indigenous cultures, that they start saying, hey, this is the best thing. This is the way to go. So in a way, they're right, but they go too far with it. Not only are they oftentimes misappropriating because of going too far with making it, putting it up on a pedestal as if it belongs to a group of people. And then people will, wait a minute, what about the Jewish people? What about the Palestinian people? What about the Hispanic people? What about Chinese? And no. This is why our book that you mentioned, that UC Berkeley selected as one of the top science books for 2022. Darsha and I really talked deeply about, should we call it Restoring the Indigenous Worldview or not? And as you can see by the title, we decided not, that the risks were too great. So we called it Restoring the Kinship Worldview. All right. Now, and the next sentence is 28 indigenous voices. So, right. Now, the reason I chose kinship, and we could call it, nature-based worldview. Those are more accurate, and they would prevent people from romanticizing it, and it would prevent people from attacking it, I think, in many ways. Because some of the most intelligent liberal professors I know are against this because of these problems I'm naming. I have chosen to refer to it as the indigenous worldview because the surviving people that still hold on to that worldview happen to be called Indigenous by the United Nations, right? And because the place-based knowledge that they have is so vital, by getting the world to start to say, wow, there's a worldview that we all had, but that a few people still have in practice, we better protect that. So I did that for the sake of Indigenous peoples. And the little video that we're going to show later, I didn't do for non-Indian people. I did for the Indigenous people of Papua New Guinea as a Fulbright international scholar, because they have lost it like so many other Indigenous cultures. They're polluting as bad as any of the non-Indians, right? So we wanted to bring worldview to them, to remember who you really are, right? And so does that help a little bit?
Yeah, it totally does. So, and it clarifies this, that it is an invitation, and it's an important one. It also has this eye-opening moment, right? I want to say more than eye-opening, probably eye-opening and maybe heart-opening, that we all at some point had, a connection. Like, this is like we all somewhere in diverse, and Indigenous becomes now a word of claiming things. And I don't want to, like, again, appropriate it, but there's a pre-de-indigenized Europe. So if we talk to like white folks who say like, I don't have culture, it's like you do. You have European or colonial culture very, very strongly present in your current context and beliefs. But if you pull back the layers of that and you begin to connect that there are diverse people around the world who, when you get to those roots, probably have lost or had taken from them, what is closer to what you're saying is an Indigenous worldview.
Well, all we have to do is change the big I to a little I to make perfect sense of it.
Okay.
That all of these diverse people were indigenous, small I, to the land on which they lived. Mm-hmm. It's just all about that. It's all about the land. That's all. It's not, we got to get out of this idea that this is somebody owns this. That this is a group of people that have an opinion about the world. Well, then we're back into the competition between science and religion, or the competition between religion and religion. If you put in the word worldview in Amazon, 90% of the books are about religion. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't want to get into that, right? So it really, let's go back to Tim's fifth grade science teacher. Yeah. Right? If that science teacher says, okay, let's just look at this from a scientific viewpoint. The worldview that some remaining Indigenous people still hold on to, that are the ways they've always done it. If there's evidence that that's successful, then I'm going to look at it, because that's what we do in this class. Now let's look at it. Well, let's see. You go to National Geographic, go on 80% of all biodiversity on Earth is on only 20% of the land mass. Now that's sad. That's scary. Mm-hmm. But guess what? Is it a coincidence that on that 20%, that's the land controlled still by traditional Indigenous peoples? That's something to be looking at as a fact. So, we have an organization called Proven Sustainable that has, I think we got 22 contemporary Indigenous cultures, and it's a great tool for teachers, science teachers, because we talk to them. Well, so how are you keeping your water clean? How are you doing this? And this is today, right? And another, I think I mentioned this on our radio show, that the largest study ever done, the science study, 450 research scientists, 15,000 peer-reviewed papers. I always like to throw that out to everybody. Showed that where Indigenous worldview was operating. So if we think about that, this isn't about people or race or anything like that. This is about people who are living with a small I, with an Indigenous awareness of being part of nature and land and the cosmos.
All right. So I put in, I don't know if you saw this 4 arrows in the chat, but it's reminding me, and I'm wondering if this is a way. Have you read the book Ishmael by Daniel Quinn?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So I've used that book in a curriculum class as an entry point to say, if what's happening here in this dialogue between the student who's looking for a teacher, the teacher becoming Ishmael, the gorilla, and if that dialogue is true, how would that shape curriculum in the way we teach? Right there, we're not, if I'm engaging in that, it's not indigenous misappropriation, but there's kind of an attempt through Daniel Quinn's dialogue between the gorilla and the student to say, we've lost our way. And there were ancient ways of being that were better, and that we need to learn back and go back to that. Is that maybe another way to talk about it?
If I was gonna play a game with you, I'd say,
Sure.
When you said ancient, you're talking indigenous, you're misappropriating.
Okay.
So it's a word game we're doing here. And so we've got the givers and the takers and
right.
And right. And so, who are the givers? I mean, it's just it's kind of it's a false effort to try to not get in trouble. And we've got to stop that. We've got to stop it. With the givers and the takers. Who are the givers and who are the takers? It's the post-colonial world was the takers, and the pre-colonial world wasn't. And who were the pre-colonial people? We can name tribes, but we don't know how to pronounce them. So, I think they were called indigenous. But don't tell anybody. We got to get away from that. We got to get away from that and say, that just happens to be the name that we give to, and then I think it is sobering to recognize that they are just like all people. And, their origin stories talk about greed and jealousy and all those things, right? And, this, again, is another example of not romanticizing. They were, just as prone to all of those things. But because they were creating understandings of the world, as we have in our chart, our worldview chart, they were managing it. And because they knew what I consider to be the most underrated force of nature in the world for human beings to consider. Anybody want to guess what that is? The most powerful force that influences human behavior in the world, that is underrated by the people who should be using it.
Underrated.
Yeah.
You're making me the big X-rated force that drives human nature, and we don't want to go there.
No, this is a phenomenon that we now can call from science and history hypnosis. Indigenous peoples were able to continue living with generosity as the highest source of courage. They were able to continue with the greater good in the community. They were able to continue with respect and knowledge of animals so that we didn't overkill. All these things. Why? Because they did ceremonies 2-3 times a day. Their language was ceremonial. And what is ceremony? Ceremony, and I'll just kind of shorten it, is hypnosis. Tomorrow we're doing a ceremony in an Ipi ceremony, a sweat house ceremony. For tomorrow is like a major event in terms of the world in alignment, and the metaphor that we can use from that, because of the solar eclipse on the 28th is the lunar one. So this month, never in our lifetimes will we have these two powerful eclipses happen. This is a turning point if we make it be so, right? Well, ceremony. What is ceremony? What is hypnosis? And now your fifth grade teacher is going, whoa, wait a minute. I just got comfortable with using the word hypnosis, indigenous. If I use hypnosis, I'm fired like this.
Yeah.
I got a book that comes out that if you go online, it just came out. It's called Hypnotic Communication in Medical Emergency Settings. Now, in 1991, Prentice Hall published that book, the original version of it. This is a revision. It wouldn't let me use the word hypnosis. So the title of the 1991 book was Patient Communication for First Responders. Because if during the first hour of trauma, most people become hyper-suggestible to the communication of a perceived trusted authority figure. Mm-hmm. So this idea of spontaneous hypnosis, we're in and out of it all the time. The first 5 years, we're in it mostly. And then kids, kind of start to grow out of it and they get more left brain. But this idea of, wait a minute, this is a tool that all creatures have. We know about animal hypnosis. And this is a tool that humans have because of our imagination is the most powerful force on earth for in terms of human activity. And so, but we are unaware of it, or all three of the Abrahamic religions say it's of the devil. And who uses it? Rush Limbaugh. I wrote a book called The Bum's Rush. I'll send you thing. The Bum's Rush, the selling of environmental backlash with phrases and fallacies of Rush Limbaugh. And brilliant, using the strategies of hypnosis that we use medically. Would you be more comfortable with your arm here? Or would you be more comfortable with your arm here? Well, when in hypnosis, a double bind, and the literalness is very powerful. Okay, I'd be more comfortable with it here. Good. Then just let that comfort that you just admitted to that you wouldn't have a second ago go in through you and lower your blood pressure. You guys could drive home tonight and God forbid there's a car accident and some young lady is in the front seat hemorrhaging and the door is jammed. You can't open it. Johnny could get on his cell phone and say, look, we got a situation here, get the ambulance coming, and then walk up, take a big deep breath, kind of do a little bit of a light trance and get his courage up and his confidence and go up to that car, just say a few words to get some rapport and say, listen, the worst is over. Things are being made ready for you at the hospital. Ambulance is on its way. But look, you got some hemorrhaging there and I can't get in there to put a 4x4 on it. Your arm's trapped under the seat belt. You can't do it. So when I count to 3, I want you to go ahead and stop your bleeding. 1, 2, 3. During the first hour before old hypnotic programs take over, just like a yogi, they can control their autonomic nervous system and the bleeding will stop. Well, think about this now in terms of, my community needs to be generous and we've got this conflict. Let's do ceremony. Let's go in and talk about it and then let's go in and pray on it. And this is a form of meditative hypnosis, right? I've got to be able to hunt better, whatever, right? We knew this without knowing the science of of it all. And so I believe that trance-based learning, that means there was a book written on healing. When the colonials came over, if they had problems with injuries, they sometimes went AWOL and went to get healed by an indigenous person, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but there were the books that were written in the late 1800s, like the fake shaman, I think one of them was called, where the guy saw this guy take worms out of the ground and then hide them, and then when he went in and he smudged the patient and danced and chanted, he pulled the worms out of the guy's stomach, and the guy got healed miraculously. Well, the author, the Western medical doctor author, said, well, he's just a charlatan, right? Well, the patient knew that this guy had gotten the worms from outside. The symbolism and metaphor helped create the image. And all hypnosis is deeply believing in an image when you're in a lower brainwave frequency. So you don't need to go pay anybody. I was vice president of the Northern California Society of Clinical Hypnosis. I taught hypnosis at UC Berkeley for MFCC licensure. And I stopped doing it because I just tell people, go get a paper clip. And if your audience is listening now, or your science teacher, get a paper clip and some dental floss and hand them out to all the kids. And then just have them hold this, and don't use the word hypnosis because they'll be fired. And then just take this pendulum and rest your elbow on the table, right? I'm resting it on my knee here, and so I'm in Mexico here, so I'm in shorts, and so now move it in a circle, just using the muscles. Okay, so and you're doing that so you can see what it looks like when it goes in a circle. All right, now stop it. Now this time you tell the students, I want you to use your imagination. I don't want you to physically do it. I just want you to imagine it going in a circle. Just imagine, believe in it. Don't think about it. Just imagine it, and bingo. The ideomotor neurons in the fingertips, once you go into a lower brainwave frequency, alpha is sufficient. I was just an alpha. Will activate those ideomotor neurons, so a lightweight pendulum will start to go in circles. Now, sometimes the kids will go, "Oh, what is that? What is that?" Or did somebody blow on? Or if you start thinking about it, I don't know if this is going to work. It won't happen, right?
Right.
But here's why to do it. I mean, Ouija board and all that kind of stuff, right? It's all part of the ideomotor neuron, even witching, all right? Mm-hmm. But once that's going, you are in a state of trance, we can call it, whereby what you believe in as an image can have a profound transformational effect in you. Mm-hmm. So by getting this going in a circle, you've saved $300 paying me to hypnotize you. Right? So, because all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. And so by getting that going in a circle and now I'm going to next time I'm near a body of water, instead of having this fear of it like I have had all since my near-death experience when I was a kid, and you have something all predetermined, because if you just have to think about it, the pendulum will stop you. You're going out of hypnosis. So you have to have, so what you're doing is you're double tasking. I want to work more towards seeing sentience in other than human beings. Mm-hmm. And then you say, I am doing it. I am seeing the sentience. And the next creature I see, I will recognize the intelligence and the similarities to me. And now you got that down. You know how to imagine that. So now you sit down. Now, eventually you don't need to use this. You just know when you're in your hypnosis or not, right? And so all the gold medalists of the Olympics in the last 50 years, they all get sports psychologists to teach them, to do this, right? I have a student who just won the world championship in fencing, Natalie Mulhausen, and they just did a movie about her in Europe called Touché. They have me on I'm one of the things on the cover. We've got to, these are in the worldview precept chart. There's 3 times we're trance-based learning, and yet it's put down. Why is it put down? Well, you look at Frank Luntz, who was the amazing guy for the Republican Party. They hire him. He's an expert in hypnosis. Expert. They hire him for the messaging that they do, right? And so anyway, so this sound, you would think, I didn't know we were going to talk about hypnosis.
But I mean,
it's good, Johnny.
I mean, it's really important and connected. It's really in a lot of the things we're talking about, and our listeners are asking questions like, how do I do this? Thank you for inviting them and us to opening up to, like, we all do this together. But then also addressing the difficulty of it and the need. And so thank you, because you bring us into, creative thought that's outside of what we're constantly hearing. And we have a friend, Joanna, who talks about every child having the right to a regulated, adult in the classroom, and schools being more regulated, not in terms of more rules and regulation, but in terms of more, slowing down and being present. And we talk about, like, so many teachers we teach and talk to are always saying classroom management, classroom this. We think we've wound learning spaces up so much that we've moved out the power of ceremony, and dare we call it that, right? Because it's spiritual, but we've moved out the power of ceremony, the power of ritual. We call regulation or meditative things spiritual and not allowed, and so we just wind things up so much that it becomes, 1, more difficult to learn and be, but 2, puts us into a state of sort of frenzy and violence, which has health impacts and then behavior impacts. So, I'm grateful because it's reminding us, like, there's resonance between what Four Arrows is sharing, what, guest Joanna shared, right? And then thinking about folks who are really talking about what's worked in their schools and classrooms, or what's working in their communities. And there's a common theme.
Let's remember how we define spirituality. And I've written about this a lot, is from an indigenous perspective, or from let's not even use the word indigenous for the rest of the program. Let's say from a nature-based focus, that this idea of spirituality, which, is the key for this worldview, could be defined as simply a sacred recognition of the significance of every other life form. Mm-hmm. That's it. And we can't think of it as a religion. We can't think of it as, it's a sacred recognition. And when you do that, then, it's a completely different ballgame.
Boy, I don't want to go, but it's like, boy, so valuing life. And you sit there and go, okay, boy, I won't get in trouble for to value life, to put that forward. It's not indigenous worldview. The other parts too, as you're talking about, I'm hearing it, visualization, putting forward this view of how I want the world to be. And you're talking about athletes, seeing themselves doing this. And I'm just thinking, as we're coming up here, because we've had a great hour, and really want to kind of bring this to a close, to think about this now. Let's keep using this 5th grade science teacher. Is this something for them to then start saying, can I start to visualize myself as an educator with this nature worldview?
Yes.
And then using that visualization of being an educator, a teacher using a nature worldview, is that the step towards moving in that direction that you're talking about?
It is, and that's a beautiful observation, because just like the person that's going up to an emergency patient in the book that we just wrote, I tell people, well, you got to do hypnosis to have that confidence, right? To go be able to do that, right? That now you can visualize, I'm going to go into this classroom and do such and such. Except, I want to add, not except, but in addition, the worldview chart of the 40 precepts. And people can go to kindredspirits.com.
And we'll actually have a link to that too in the show notes.
But let's just say, but those things are what, if you practice because, the things that we want to self-hypnotize ourselves into being is an emphasis on the balance between doing things for self-gain only, or, doing things for the greater good. These precepts, right? Being less anthropocentric and more spiritual. So we got to get specific, and we've got to be consistent. And so I had somebody came over from Correas, a nearby resort, for some help. And we talked about the worldview chart, and she's a very wealthy person. And I said, let's talk about it. Let's just look at the first one, which was non-hierarchy and hierarchy. Because indigenous cultures, for the most part, were considered non-hierarchical, except for a buffalo hunt or something like that. But generally, non-hierarchical, matriarchal. And so she said, well, yeah, I don't believe in hierarchy, right? And I said, well, what about participating in it with your economic system and, first class airplanes and, she said, well, yeah, I guess a little bit. And then, let me use a gentleman for this case. So the gentleman was saying, was choosing hierarchy, and said, I think that one I can really work on and get less hierarchical, even though of my position, and I own $1 million house, all that stuff. So I said, well, let's look down. Is there any other ones that you need to work on? And I knew this guy, and he had a low respect for women. And that's the 40th one. So the first one is about hierarchy. The 40th one is about, I said, well, you're going to work really hard on non-hierarchy. You can't pick and choose. It's not like I'm going to choose, instead of an eye for an eye, I'm going to choose, the golden rule. You can't, they got to match. If you got two things like that going on in the same book, you got to figure out how to balance them, right? And so I said, let's go. And I jumped all the way to number 40, and I said, I know you pretty well. And, can you do that and not change that and get that into balance? And he went, oh, criminy. Now you're really asking me to do some trans work, So my point is the use of the chart and all the work that went into it I delineate these 40 moral precepts that are undergirding our science, our economics, our education, our media, our entertainment, and our sports. That's the key to doing what you just said is to have that and do that with people, with others, and share and be honest about it. Well, I can work on that a little bit, but sometimes I got to be more materialistic because of such and such and da da da. And it's a dialogue. Up until now, worldview has always been a stopping of dialogue. Now it's a requirement for them.
Here we are, and again, we could go on and on and on, but we're going to kind of bring it down here. But Johnny, what a day of professional development. I see you got something there. I
think it's been just a wonderful gift of thinking through this, especially for listeners who are interested in, we talked before we got on the show about bringing Indigenous knowledge into your classroom, and in certain states, it's law, but is it really happening in our schools and in our classrooms, and what are some of the barriers? So for teachers listening, this is hopefully given, some depth or some explanation to the invitation that Four Arrows is making, but also that Indigenous educators around the world are saying, okay, it's all hands on deck. This isn't just for Indigenous kids. We got that covered. This is for all schools to really be thinking about having that dialogue around expanding worldview. And Tim, you said, it's about valuing life, which I think is really important, but only if you understand life as a system of relationships and not a singularity, right? So again, that big worldview. Yep. So it's about valuing living systems, and within that, yes, life. And I want to, before we end, I want to bring it back to, for folks who didn't listen to the radio show, a really powerful moment where language and culture provide an example of how Indigenous knowledge systems, right, help recenter our focus on that relationality. And Four Arrows, can you remind us how you say water?
Mini Wichoni. And Ni Wichoni is the essence of life itself, as powerful as the milk of mother's breast.
So, and that's not just how you say water. That's how the word water, the language for the life-sustaining liquid, right? Or it can be a solid or a gas, right? But this force, water is life, is the actual word that kids would use, families would use, communities would use, and we're not over-romanticizing it. That's
not at all.
That's a common language.
And if it did get icy, then like in Alaska, there's like 130 words for snow. So the intimacy and the detail isn't just a categorized boom. It's much more powerful than that, right? Yeah, and so I think the four words that come to my mind that are represented in our in this rebalancing of worldviews to get us into a nature-based understanding. We have to, first of all, we have to appreciate that nature is not a Darwinian dog eat dog survival of the fittest. We have to really understand that Peter Kropotkin got it right when he wrote his book Mutual Aid, because even Darwin said that, right? Ultimately, it's about mutual aid. So we got to get that. And then now we can say, okay, now nature-based. All right. So reciprocity, 4 R's: reciprocity, respect, responsibility, and relevance. And if we could bring that into the classroom and use the worldview chart to find balance between our dominant colonial and our pre-colonial ways, then we have a chance for rebuilding, at least.
Yeah, which could be the 5th R, rebuilding.
Yeah, rebuilding.
We could add 6 R's, riot. If you can't do the first 5 R's, then riot. No, we're not asking you to riot, but maybe to chill, engage in some ceremony, and connect with recognizing these things. I think that's really, really thoughtful and important for us. Tim, what do you got for us? I was just going to say,
Wahinkpe Topa, 4 Arrows. Thank you for busting pencils.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for the work you're doing in the world.
Miigwech.
Want more busted pencils? Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Busted Pencils, or log on to BustEDpencils.com for blogs, podcasts, and more. Join us again next Tuesday for Busted Pencils on Devil Radio 92.7.